Thanks, Mark. Can you see the full screen or not yet? There we go. Had a bit of a glitch there. Okay, so hi everyone. So I'll just be walking through a prioritization framework / tool that we developed in consultation or collaboration with Toronto and Nature Conservation Authority. And it was a collaboration facilitated through an organization called MyTax Accelerate, which funds this connection between university or institutions and conservation agencies. And we thought it was a great opportunity to really try and have a go at understanding or formulating some way of prioritizing invasive species management in a complex social management mosaic like an urban area. So the partner organization, as I said, was the TRCA, and Mark was involved with this project as well. And the ultimate goal of this project was to develop a prioritization framework for the strategic management of invasive alien plants in the Greater Toronto area. So I'll just jump straight into it for the sake of time. So essentially, there are a lot of prioritization frameworks that have been developed around the world. And here are some examples of those. But there are some problems in trying to adapt those to urban environments. So most of these frameworks are designed for use in natural areas. And the criteria that are used in the assessments are generally not applicable to all systems. So the spatial scale often differs. So many are at the national scale, and many exclusively assess negative impacts. And as I've mentioned before, urban areas are more complex than these natural areas in that there are a lot of land parcels, a lot of stakeholders with different views and opinions, and many of these urban residents derive benefits from these invasive species. And this obviously results in conflicts of interest. So this really complicates attempts to prioritize and manage invasive species generally. So the focus area for this project was the area under the jurisdiction of the TRCA. So what we have is the city of Toronto, and the city of Toronto boundary is this dotted line around here. But essentially the grayed out area is all the areas that are under the jurisdiction of, or under the management of the TRCA. And there are obviously encompasses surrounding municipalities. So it really includes the really highly urbanized area of Toronto, which has in excess of 3.5 million people. And the ultimate area size is 3,500 square kilometers. So it includes this urban gradient. So it goes from really urbanized area from downtown Toronto all the way to some agricultural areas and then natural forested areas on the outskirts. So we took a two-pronged approach for this prioritization framework. We looked to develop a framework for prioritizing invasive species, and also a framework to prioritize sites for management. And I'll focus on the first approach for the majority of this presentation. And for the sake of this project, we looked solely at terrestrial invasive plant species, but as will become clear throughout the talk, that this framework can be modified to include other taxonomic groups. So it can include things like aquatic species, terrestrial fauna species, and I'll just explain how that can take place and how you can tailor it to fit these different taxonomic groups. And then what is key in this approach, and what we really wanted to include, is this engagement with stakeholders. And I'll talk quite a bit about this as we go along. So this is the ultimate framework that we developed, the procedure to go about the species-based assessment. So we the first step would be to select a subset of assessment criteria. And I'll go through each of these steps in more detail as we go along, but I'll just run through the overall approach here. So after we have decided on the criteria that we are going to include in the framework, the next step is then to develop a candidate species list. So a subset of species that that you would then run through the framework to then have a priority ranking at the end of the assessment. And just ignoring the stakeholder workshop box for now, it then diverges into two separate things. So what we call an evidence-based assessment and an expert-based assessment. Now, the evidence-based assessment is essentially collating data from scientific and the grey literature, and then conducting the assessment for each candidate species in our list based on what evidence is available in the literature, and then doing the ranking on that basis. The other side of things is the expert-based assessment, and this is really where we engage with stakeholders. So we essentially convert the assessment into an online survey. That wasn't initially the case, but we had to do so because of COVID. So then we'd have a pool of experts, so invasive species experts that actually manage invasive species on the ground. We then present them with this online survey, which is essentially the assessment in an online format. And they are then requested to conduct this assessment for a subset of candidate species. And then we'd develop a separate ranking based on the expert-based assessment, and then we'd combine both of these evidence-based and expert-based assessments into an overall ranking. And the box at the top there just shows how important it is throughout this process, initially, in the development of the criteria and obviously the candidate species list, to engage with these experts closely throughout that process. So the first step in this process is to develop a set of objective criteria to determine which invasive species should be strategically managed and monitored across the TRCA's jurisdiction. So for this, we based our framework on that of this paper by Mark Robertson et al. In 2003. And this framework really has been adopted worldwide and used to inform invasive species risk assessments, etc., not only in South Africa, where it was initially developed, but globally in countries like Australia, China, India, and the US. But as the criteria in this paper were developed for natural areas and at the national scale, so for the entire country of South Africa, we needed to modify the criteria and the modules, which I'll talk about later, to be more applicable to our area of interest and just urban areas specifically. And to do this, we drew from various sources, including the Australian Weed Risk Assessment, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, Categorization of Ecosystem Services, which came out in 2005, and then drawing from several other primary studies that looked at ecosystem services and invasive species in urban areas generally. But just one other thing is that we did retain the calculation, the formula that Robertson et al. Used in their framework. And I'll just talk about this in a bit more detail here. So what we have are modules on the left, the criteria that we decided on under the criteria column, and then a generic weighting that is assigned, and I'll describe this in more detail just now. An assigned weighting, criteria scores, and confidence scores. So I'll just briefly go through each of these now. And this is kind of all based on that framework by Robertson et al. We just tailored the criteria and the various levels of criteria accordingly. So we decided on, in consultation with the stakeholders and the experts, that we'd have 8 modules, and the bracket number next to each module is the number of sub-criteria within that module. And you'll see here, for example, invasion status, you have invasive elsewhere, closely related to invasive taxon. And this goes down for each module. So for example, you have for positive impacts, you have the categorization of the ecosystem service assessment, where you've got a range of 19 impact criteria there, and so on. So then you have the weighting at the top, and this weighting really is is quite simple. So within these criteria, you again have sub-criteria within these. For example, the invasive elsewhere, and I've just put in brackets here, this is a simple yes or no for this framework. And then the weighting would be either assigned 0 or 1. And the highest weightings here are associated with the most undesirable characteristics. So for example, invasive elsewhere, yes would be the most undesirable factor, so we'd add then a weighting of 1 to that. And that's where this assigned weighting comes from. So I've just used these as examples here. For example, this theoretical hypothetical species, if it's closely related to invasive taxon, then yes would be the most undesirable, so it would get an assignment of 1, but we've just given a 0 here just to show you the difference. And then again, germination requirements. Within that, there are 4 sub-criteria not shown in this table, but it would go from 0 to 3, again, 3 being the most undesirable. So then you would assign each a weighting based on the generic weighting system here. And then the criterion scores would then be calculated based on that. So the score for each criterion is divided by the maximum possible score for that criterion. So for example, here, the maximum weighting here would be 3, and here we've got the assigned weighting of 2, so then it would just be the 2 over 3 to give 0.67. And then importantly, we assign a confidence score here, and confidence scores are assigned to each criterion based on the uncertainty and availability of evidence in the literature. And this is assigned either a value of 0, 0.5, or 1. Now, if there was sufficient published evidence and data was certain, then the confidence score would be assigned a value of 1. But if data were uncertain or based on unpublished data, like, for example, gray literature, or just experience, then a confidence score of 0.5 would be assigned. And then if data were missing or based on interpretation of studies, then the confidence score would be assigned 0. So there's really some confidence weighting that can be assigned to this to give it some validity. So I won't go through the criteria in detail, but this is essentially the approach that we've taken here and the calculations assigned to that. So then you've got your criterion scores and your confidence scores. So these are the important columns that we'll keep in our mind here. And then just we have our modules here, and then the module scores here, which is essentially the sum of the criterion scores. So the sum of these scores here divided by the number of criteria in that module. So the number of criteria that were included in this module, so 3, 8, 2, 1, 7, etc. And similarly for the module confidence, it would be the sum of the confidence scores. So the column on the right, again, divided by the number of criteria in that module. And then to calculate the total prioritization score would be the sum of all those scores, and similarly, the total confidence score would be the sum of the module scores. And then to calculate the final prioritization score, we just the product of those 2 scores would then give you the final prioritization score. All of this may be a bit much to take in at this time, but I think if you do have any questions, you're welcome to let me know, and I'd be happy to walk through this again. We have developed spreadsheets which automate this process to some extent, so I'm happy to share that if you're interested. So now that we've developed the prioritization criteria for the assessment, the next step would then be to develop the candidate species list. And of course, in some data deficient areas, this might be very tricky. There are ways to go around it, but we were lucky in that we have Mark Cadot in Toronto, and he was able to recently publish a list of vascular plants for the city of Toronto, which is a really comprehensive data set. And I think in this data set, Mark used several different species lists, including records from the Royal Ontario Museum, TRCA's own biological inventories, GBIF, records from Mark's lab, and some other sources to inform this database. Now, in the absence of empirical data on species abundance, estimates of abundance were included based on the number of occurrences in the ROM and the GBIF lists. So a composite abundance measure was created from the ROM and GBIF estimates by scaling both sets to between 1 and 100, and then taking the average of the two. And then either the scaled ROM or GBIF estimates were used if the other was missing. And a preliminary candidate list was then created with the most recorded species, essentially ranked in order of abundance. So abundance here is kind of used, or the number of records is kind of used as a proxy for abundance. So then what we did is we created this priority list of what we initially had as 35 recorded species, and they were ranked in order of occurrence or abundance. And this was the sort of the first step, and here we've just shown the 25 species, but it extended to 35. Obviously, the amount of effort that is required to run each species through the assessment is quite high. So, it depends on how many people you can get on board to perform the assessment. For this, it was just myself, so we did need to keep the number of species quite low for initially. And I'll explain how we ended up expanding that list in a moment. So then the next step, and bear in mind, this is all still that evidence-based assessment approach. So we're just looking at what is available in the literature to inform this assessment. And this just shows you the overall framework that we developed in just a spreadsheet format. So you were familiar with what I walked you through earlier, and this is just a sort of those criteria and sub-criteria just expanded, just to give you an insight into how it would look. With our modules here highlighted in green, the criteria or sub-criteria in bold, and then the relevant or the respective sub-criteria and the options. And then this is just something we did for Vinsicotoxicum rossicum, which has been spoken about before. And then at the end of the spreadsheet, you'd have those calculations that I walked through. So you'd have the modules here, the sum of the criterion scores, and then you'd get a criterion score, a confidence score, and then again, you just, the product of these two scores would then give you the final prioritization score. So we did this for initially 35 species. We did host a workshop with the experts, which I'll discuss in more detail in a moment. But during this workshop, we requested the experts to give us some feedback on which species they think would be important to include in this assessment process. And we then expanded our list from 35 species to 50 species. And then we ran all 50 species through the assessment. And then we developed a priority a list ranking these in terms of their final prioritization scores, which again is based on the criterion scores and the confidence scores. And this is the preliminary list that we developed. And many of you might have questions about this. We've discussed it at length, the inclusion of common dandelion, and members of the TRCA would say that it's not often something they would manage. But again, based on the assessment criteria that we have included, the species, it does pop out as a real priority in terms of its biological characteristics specifically. So now that we've ranked these species according to the prioritization scores, and we looked at this based on the evidence in the literature, we wanted to get input from the stakeholders, so the experts in invasive species management. So we held this workshop where we had roughly 20 experts on invasive species management. We ran them through the project, the background of the project, and there was much discussion around the species list. So some species shouldn't be included. And again, this is how we expanded the list from 35 to 50 species. There was, of course, discussion on the criteria. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, that it's really key to be in close conversation with the experts throughout this process. So if you include criteria that they don't often manage for, then there's a mismatch. So you really need to engage with them at every stage refine and get a framework that is applicable to them. And this was a really useful workshop in that it allowed us to really hone this framework that we had developed and really pull out some of the key criteria that are applicable for this framework that we intend to develop. And then of course, yeah, we use their feedback to finalize and refine that framework. And as I mentioned earlier, we translated the assessment into an online survey because this had to be done virtually. So we then, during this workshop, we gave them a breakdown of the framework. So essentially what I've done with you now, and just ran you through the mechanics of the framework. And then did a dry run, so gave them some example species just to test out. And then that was obviously useful. So it would really get everyone thinking about the criteria that we've included and at the species level. And then once we had that dry run of the online survey, then we did request for these experts to complete a survey officially on a subset of candidate species in their own time. So it was we gave each stakeholder a subset of species to then to complete this online survey at their own time, and then we then use that feedback. So then again, we'd have the evidence-based assessment and this assessments from the experts, and then we can do some interesting comparisons to show what the literature would suggest and what the expert-based assessments show. And to date, the experts weren't able to provide assessments for all 50 species, but we did have species for I think we had assessments for 20 species, but this was just a preliminary list of the final ranking of species based just on the expert input. And again, what you see is dog strangling vine popping up again at the top. What I haven't mentioned, and what many of you might be thinking, is that developing some sort of weighting for each of these modules or criteria would be important in determining more accurate or refined priorities for each species. Now, what we did do in the online survey was requested that that the experts weight or rank the modules in terms of their highest to lowest importance. And this was just a really quick way to get some sort of relative weighting for each module. And again, this framework does allow for these weightings to be integrated into the framework. So for our purposes, we didn't include weights yet. We are going to integrate this into our final result as an initial way forward. But essentially what you would like to do is really get a broad group of stakeholders and host another workshop where you do establish pairwise comparisons of all these modules, and then you would then integrate a more formalized weighting system into this. But nonetheless, the framework does allow for these modules to be weighted. So again, we just did this a quick thing at the end of the survey and asked them to rank the modules in terms of their perceived importance, and then we just got a normalized weight from that, which you can then feed into the assessment, which would then just tweak those final prioritization scores. So for example, negative impacts obviously came on top because these are experts in management, and positive impacts at the bottom, so there's an obvious bias there. But what that would do is for example, a species like Taraxacum, the common dandelion, is not necessarily going to have huge negative impacts. So if we do add this weighting system to that species would likely drop a few ranks if we were to integrate these weightings into the framework. So that's essentially the first prong approach, so the species-based assessment. And we were also interested in doing a complementary framework which looked at which areas needed to be the focus of management. And this was really to identify areas that needed protecting based on the ecosystem functions and services. So protecting ecosystem function services from the impacts of invasive species. And I won't spend too much time on this approach, again, because it can get quite detailed, going into the criteria, but it's a fairly simplistic approach that we did develop. So again, it follows a similar approach in that you have to develop a set of criteria, and then for the purpose of this approach, you then match spatial data with the criteria that you have identified, and then you do an overall raster analysis, which for our purposes again was equally weighted. And I'll just show you the list of criteria we came up with. Again, it's level 1, 2, and 3 criteria. So the first level criteria we felt were important were obviously biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, and then ecosystem services. And then we had these sub-criteria within that, habitat and biodiversity, and then some really more detailed criteria, level 3 criteria that we did include. I won't go through each of these because they aren't so important for the purpose of this, but ecosystem services, again, categorized according to the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in 2005. We excluded the supporting services category here because those are largely covered by these biodiversity and ecosystem functioning criteria. So you can see here some important ecosystem service criteria like education, recreation, obviously really key in urban areas, heritage. So there are some really important things that need to be taken into account when trying to identify which areas you need to look at. And we're obviously lucky in that Toronto and the surrounding municipalities have really good open data portals, and the TRCA obviously have excellent data on a lot of things. So we were able to extract quite a bit of data from these data portals, from these respective municipalities, and then use the spatial data then to do some mapping of these different criteria. So just to remind you of where we are, Toronto, and this is kind of the footprint here, but again, the TRCA jurisdiction extends a bit beyond that into the outskirts. And I'll just jump straight into what we developed at the end of this. So if you can imagine all of those criteria with their own spatial data overlaid on top of one another, then you've got these areas that jump out as hotspots. So the red areas here would be areas of high priority, and I think this was done to the 10-meter cell size. So this just shows a map of the areas in which the number of criteria. So obviously the closer to the red end of the spectrum, you've got more criteria that were applicable for that area, and then would therefore be important in management. So yeah, the assessment with changing weights. So again, this framework does allow for relative weightings to be incorporated into the framework. So the analysis would just change a little bit in that you would do a weighted sum analysis where you would add in the relative weightings of each data set that you'd be running, and then it would then just adjust the weightings accordingly. And again, what is important here is that those weightings are determined through a stakeholder engagement. And this just separates the two level 1 criteria. So I'll just show you the maps it just shows you the maps of those two level 1 criteria. You've got biodiversity and ecosystem functioning on the left, and then ecosystem services on the right. And obviously there being a big focus in Toronto, where obviously there's a high population density. But this is the overall map, combining both biodiversity and ecosystems functioning and ecosystem service models. So that is essentially the two approaches that we worked on. And again, managing invasive species in urban areas is highly complex, but what's important here is that there's a need to consider negative and positive impacts of invasive plants. And in doing so, we covered both aspects in our frameworks, and something that was lacking in currently available frameworks around the world. And we used evidence-based and expert-based assessments, which included stakeholder engagement, and in doing so allowed us transparent, defensible frameworks that can be modified, and new data can be incorporated as it becomes available. So I've got my colleague Namrata Shrestha on the line here as well, who would be open to answering any questions that we do have from the TRCA side. But if anyone does have any questions, we'd be happy to take any. Thank you.